Thank you, Andrew. Hello and welcome to our webinar, Agile Crisis Leadership with Marc Chubb, Chief Resilience Officer for ManitouNW. I'm Jerry Kokinos, Program Associate at the CAT School. I want to take a moment to mention the Enterprise Risk Management Program at the Yeshiva University CAT School. Our 30-credit master's program is offered online or on campus in New York City. Glassdoor.com recently listed Risk Manager on its Best Jobs in America list. Our curriculum prepares you to manage risk in industries including emergency management, finance, insurance, cybersecurity, and more. During the webinar, please enter questions in either the Q&A or chat boxes. If you are having any technical difficulties, please let us know via chat and we'll have someone contact. I would now like to introduce Andrew Boyarsky, Academic Director of Risk, Operations, and Emergency Management Programs at the CAT School. Andrew?
Thank you very much, Jerry. I appreciate that. So I'd like to first, I want to thank everyone who's in attendance today for attending. And I want to start off by introducing my colleague and our lead presenter, Marc Chubb. Marc is the Chief Resilience Officer for ManitouNW LLC and a Senior Fire Protection Consultant with Intelligent Corporation. He's the former Chief Fire Officer of Christchurch, New Zealand, where he was an area commander for the New Zealand Fire Service. And during his tenure there, Marc was closely involved with the leaders of 8 local governments in the Canterbury region to develop, implement, and evaluate comprehensive emergency management plans for all hazards and all risks. His master's thesis explored public involvement processes surrounding the development of seismic strengthening standards for existing buildings in New Zealand, and Marc was the lead author of FEMA's course on social media in emergency management. His current consulting work for Fortune 100 corporations focuses on risk management and hazard mitigation within their own facilities and across their supply chain partners. I want to thank you very much, Marc, for leading our podcast this afternoon, depending on what part of the country that you're in.
Thank you, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be here with you and with these.
So, Marc, let's frame our discussion first by defining what a disaster is, an emergency, a catastrophe, and what can cause a crisis.
Well, for the purpose of our discussion today, I want to emphasize 2 things. First, emergencies, disasters, and catastrophes are social constructs we use to describe the impacts or effects of incidents or events on people and human organizations. The second thing I want to emphasize is that leaders, and by that I mean to be more inclusive than just those with power or those in authority, leaders play key roles in helping people face the disruption of such incidents or events by confronting and managing change. As such, leadership plays a constructive or destructive role upon the decisions and actions leaders take. And this relates back to the first point insofar as our decisions and actions play important roles in determining whether and to what extent we will face disruption when confronted with a natural hazard, a technological hazard, or a criminal or terrorist threat. In these then the best time to make decisions and take actions is before an event occurs. After an event starts or it becomes apparent, we often find our ability to adapt and catch up limited by comparison to the pace of the events themselves and the multiplier effects of social amplification, which of course often occur in response to or as a reflection of the actions of those looked upon as leaders in organizations and societies. So crises then constitute an added layer on top of emergencies, disasters, and catastrophes. As leaders, we create them or we avoid them through our decisions and actions.
So let's explore this a little bit further and define the factors that differentiate an emergency from a disaster, a calamity, and catastrophe. Now, in our common parlance, people use some of these things, some of these words somewhat interchangeably. but certainly in emergency management, our understanding of perception of what constitutes various levels of emergency and their response is different. And I know among emergency managers, people who are involved in crisis response, there are differing opinions around this. But can you explain this a little bit further and define these terms more clearly based on the model that we have here?
You're very right, Andrew, that there is some disagreement about these terms, and the way that they're used is often interchangeable. But I find it helpful for the purpose of understanding how leaders relate to these situations and how they can impact the decisions and actions of others to be a little bit more distinctive about this. This model tries to do that by starting in the lower left corner. We face disruptions of many sorts pretty often. Indeed, we can be almost certain that someone somewhere is confronting an emergency right now. Of course, the emergency is defined by their expectations and their reaction to their circumstances. Now, it's pretty unfortunate for those experiencing the loss or disruption of an emergency, but they can be pretty certain that their pain and suffering will abate soon and that people and processes are in motion to help them adapt to their situation. As we move to the upper left, we can see situations like many of those that have occurred in recent years, where events produce ripple effects beyond those immediately impacted. Terrorist threats, for instance, affect all of us, whether we live in proximity to a threat or not. The desire, if not the need, to implement measures to reduce our exposure to harm before an event occurs places new limits on us whether we like it or not. Moving back to the lower right-hand corner, even if we know something bad is coming, like an earthquake or a flood or a tornado, we don't know when. We often cannot prepare ourselves adequately to take the consequences in stride. But we know we will need help, and often we will receive help from people beyond our immediate circle of known associates and the resources we have readily at hand to respond and recover. Now, these events force us to interrupt our activities and redirect our energy and effort, even after immediate threat of loss has passed. Failure to do so results in compounding impacts. Catastrophes, moving to the upper right corner, however, combine the influences of overwhelming need with impacts well beyond the scope of those directly affected. Hurricane Katrina provided a vivid example of this, as has Hurricane Maria. Not only did these events overwhelm the local resources and responders, but they also placed great strains on national and international aid networks. The fact that much of Puerto Rico remains without power months after the storm illustrates these kinds of effects. But so too does the diaspora the storm created. Many Puerto Ricans and Virgin Islanders, faced with the disruption and privation of remaining on these islands without power for an extended period and receiving basic services, became refugees in their country and fled to live with relatives on the mainland until conditions improved sufficiently to take up the tasks of recovery back home.
So let's address recovery from this emergency management situation that we can find ourselves. And we know that the process of recovery can be long, and certainly response. Can you walk us through the four aspects of managing expectations in a crisis along this model?
Yeah, this model mirrors the previous slide and looks at how we respond and recover, with the emphasis, of course, on recovery. When we look back at the scope and scale of disasters, it's awfully easy to become preoccupied with the physical effects. Clearly, the damage and disruption call for active measures, but they also call for organization and collective action. No matter how motivated we may be to do something, we can always achieve by working together. And of course, our police and fire responders are examples of a way that the community comes together to respond to those needs in the case of emergencies. In routine circumstances, we can usually put things right again with little assistance beyond what's already available to us on a day-to-day basis. But when the events challenge our notion of what counts for a reasonable response, especially when we see things in hindsight we could have done differently to keep something bad from happening, we need to work together differently. And that's illustrated in the R3 section of this diagram by devising new ways of looking at our situation that encourage us to consider or implement new countermeasures. when we move down to R2, we see that as the scope and scale of physical effects increases, so does the level of effort required to organize and sustain the level of social organization and cohesion required to put things right. Often the challenges are not just putting things right, but making them better. When for instance, the earthquake disaster hit Christchurch, the opportunity to not build back but to build differently became readily apparent to decision makers. And here's where the challenges of leadership become more acute. As you move up to R4, catastrophes require social learning and leadership. Those elements become a defining characteristic of catastrophic response. An organization or society cannot achieve a degree of normalcy without reconciling its future with its past. Leaders who help people move decisively away from the old way of thinking and doing to new ways that lead everyone to consensus, the future will be better, or even much different than the past, will successfully respond to and recover from catastrophes. Now, the example of Starbucks under Howard Schultz provides an example of this, where the impacts were very real for Starbucks as a corporation, and probably couldn't be characterized as a catastrophe for anybody other than the company shareholders. But it provides a good example of how leadership in this context works. When Howard Schultz departed as chief executive officer several years ago, after building Starbucks into a global brand and turning the reins over to a new CEO, he was confronted with evidence of lagging sales and declining customer satisfaction. Howard was asked by the board to step in and lead day-to-day operations. Before his departure the first time, Howard failed to appreciate the degree to which Starbucks had defined itself and its success in terms of his personal attributes and character. When he stepped out of the picture, others' leadership characteristics played a greater role in how customers experienced Starbucks brand. In the absence of a defining culture, these characteristics created conflicts and inconsistencies that undermined the experience of customers and associates. After his return, Howard made it clear that Starbucks was not in the coffee business. It sells an experience, he said, and coffee is just one part of that experience. As the CEO again, Howard stepped in to define the culture in a way that valued quality, put customer experience first, which made it possible for him to redirect his energy and involvement with the company to finding new ways to create innovative and unique experiences for Starbucks customers.
So, with that in mind, we can think of Howard Schultz and other corporate leaders, and the fact that they have that pedigree of having founded the company and then coming back. Steve Jobs being one that many of our participants are very familiar with. People have an intrinsic confidence in their ability to lead and their ability to communicate. I want to look at situations where there's a requirement of multiple levels of leadership. So when we look at the graphic on the right, we have 3 different levels: presidential, state, and the local mayor. What causes a crisis in confidence in leadership? Given this type of example.
Well, the leaders that you've just described are a great place to start our discussion. We tend to think of leadership and leaders that we admire and emulate because of their charisma. But charisma doesn't do much for leaders in situations like emergencies, disasters, and catastrophes. Actually, confidence and communication matter much, much more. If catastrophes are about the scope and scale of effects, especially from a social and organizational perspective, then crises are just about the experience of confidence among the people being led. When people lose confidence in leaders' ability to help them adapt to change and adopt new behaviors to cope with their evolving circumstances, the scope and scale of the physical effects start to matter a whole lot less. And we saw this vividly in the case of Katrina, which is illustrated in the picture at the right. The pattern has repeated itself many times. Hurricane Katrina provided vivid examples through the actions of Mayor Ray Nagin, in George W. Bush's FEMA administrator, Michael Brown. When people lose confidence in the courage, conviction, compassion, connection, or competence of leaders, they find it difficult to organize themselves to confront even the everyday challenges presented by an incident or event. In my experience, people focus first and foremost on how leaders communicate when making judgments about these characteristics of their leaders. The more a leader engages and involves others, the more likely that the community will see them and their decisions as a reflection of their own vision and values.
I want to focus on the communication aspect, because that's one that, again, our participants probably see the most of or hear the most of. And all the stakeholders who are involved in an emergency situation, and there's quite a variety of them you're very familiar with. How does a leader effectively communicate during a disaster or an emergency situation to reduce that sense of crisis?
Well, before a disaster strikes, we tend to have a thought that crisis leadership is one dimensional. Command and control approaches, in which the leader gives direction and orients action toward an objective, is appropriate, but only in limited circumstances, and then usually only for a limited time. In recent years, emergency managers and emergency response organizations have become much more aware of the limitations of command and control approaches to incident management. They've started talking more in terms of coordination. Sadly, this also has some severe limitations. Coordination implies avoiding conflict rather than engaging in concerted action with shared objectives and shared resources, which, of course, scarcity usually follows disasters and often requires prioritization and negotiation. Cooperation and collaboration, which define consensus and underpin resilience, involve a lot more give and take. And this implies shared values and vision through which leaders reflect and amplify the aspirations of their followers. People
Marc?
expectations simply by soothing or suppressing negative emotions. Instead, leaders should focus on positive actions people can take together to improve conditions with a view toward turning short-term aims or objectives into long-term gains or progress.
Marc, one thing I'd like to if anyone missed it at the start of our webinar, you were actually you were fire chief out in the Seattle area, and you've had some experiences in this area in terms of response to large urban types of fires. Can you describe that and relate that to understanding the constituents and their experience versus understanding the incident from the leader's experience, and how that's a shared experience?
Sure.
Is really critical.
Yeah, I think one of the best examples of this occurred when I was fire officer in Christchurch, and we had a wildland urban interface fire on the edge of the city during a hot, windy spell. Our communication center received multiple calls to separate incidents, or what they thought were separate incidents, and dispatched crews to 4 different locations. By the time it became apparent that we were all combating a single fire that was exposing a neighborhood of lifestyle blocks, houses and outbuildings on 10-acre blocks, it was very difficult to get control of our own response, much less focus ourselves on how to engage the community itself. I took a decision at the time that seemed appropriate to me from a command and control perspective to cordon the area off and evacuate the civilians so that we could regroup our response resources and attack the fire with a unified direction and strategy. Now, this backfired horribly. In the end, it undermined the confidence of the community in my leadership and in the leadership of the fire service. And it took us months to rebuild that trust because people felt that we had essentially disqualified them or dismissed their concerns and their desire to help us manage a situation that was affecting them most directly. Fortunately, not only for me, but for the Christchurch community, the lessons from that incident were well learned and practiced with great effect in the response to the Christchurch and Canterbury earthquake sequence. When emergent community response began to occur, emergency managers were uh, much more predisposed to incorporating those volunteer organizations into the response and recovery operation, which of course boosted confidence that the community was responding in a collective fashion to the crisis it was facing.
So I'd like to build on this concept of consensus building and working with the constituencies that are impacted by a crisis situation. The person who's pictured here is James Burke, who is the former chief executive officer of Johnson & Johnson. And he is considered a prime example of someone who dealt with a crisis situation effectively. For those who are in our webinar today, you may not be familiar with the case. In 1982, 7 people died from poisoned Tylenol capsules that had been tampered with. And for those of us who were around at that time, I remember very well being called into school, and the bottles, them actually telling our students that we needed to remove those capsules from our home, and if we had them, not to take them. James Burke ordered that all Tylenol bottles be withdrawn from the shelves, and he warned the public not to use what they had purchased. Now, he also offered to replace any purchased products, and in short order, he implemented changes to the packaging. And these are changes in packaging that we see to this day. This cost the company well over $100 million at the time, but he did this without hesitation and with the full support of the company, from the board level down to the line level. And this is a good illustration of an example of how to respond in crisis. Marc, looking at this example, would you relate this to the concept of emergent leadership?
Absolutely. One of the things that I think Burke understood implicitly, and it's important to emphasize here, reminds me of a quote that Peter Drucker is attributed with having said. Drucker said, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." One of my other favorite leadership theorists, Henry Mintzberg of McGill University, who's also a past president of the Strategic Planning Society, has been very critical of strategic plans and strategic planning as corporate tools. He's made it clear that successful corporate cultures understand and embody the importance of strategy and strategic thinking, though. And Mintzberg's work has highlighted the importance of these as elements of adaptive leadership. In his view, effective leaders maintain support for their decisions and actions by recognizing and responding to changing circumstances in ways that leverage strengths, build consensus, and implement change where it's required. Burke's actions provide a good illustration of this. Faced with evidence that his company's products were associated with several deaths, he didn't hesitate to take action. But rather than acting alone in ways that were consistent with shareholder expectations of preserving shareholder value and return on investment, Burke voluntarily withdrew his company's products from store shelves rather than face the prospect of more deaths. And these quick actions introduced new packaging designs, which cost the company additional money, restored confidence, and gave everybody in the company, from the shareholders to the employees on the shop floor, specific actions they could take to restore the integrity of the brand and build long-term value, even at the short-term expense of losing sales and destroying inventory. In return, customers saw Burke's actions and Johnson & Johnson's actions as evidence that the company was prepared to put people before profit.
Yes, and we've seen a lot of good examples of that. I think if we look at responses to Hurricane Katrina, where some corporate responders, I know that Walmart, Home Depot came to basically respond to actually increase their resource allocation to help with the response. What I'd like to do is, you worked as fire chief in Christchurch, New Zealand. You were also heavily involved in the emergency preparedness process until late 2007. You went through 2 full cycles of planning, and under the emergency management legislation and regime, which you helped to put in place, along with many others, that was adopted in 2001. Tell us about that experience, and how does a leader need to operate effectively in an emergency and a response?
Well, the response, or the way that the leader needs to act, has to begin before the response. And I think that's one of the things that I took away from the planning process and the strategic discussions we had in Christchurch and Canterbury, New Zealand, in the lead up to the earthquake sequence in 2010 and 2011. New Zealand was an early adopter of what we in the U.S. now refer to as the all hazards, all risks approach to community-based comprehensive emergency management planning. But this approach wasn't limited to emergency management in New Zealand. It incorporated all aspects of community development and fiscal planning. Community involvement was critical to local government operations. This approach in New Zealand recognized that leaders include many people in the community beyond their elected representatives. It also recognizes that leadership energy and effort flows many directions throughout a community. At its most basic level, it recognizes that leadership, as I've already defined it, involves helping people adapt to changing circumstances. The only thing that changes is the speed with which those changes are occurring. As such, planning and preparing for emergencies requires us to look beyond expectations and start to embrace aspirations. This diagram illustrates some of the key elements of this approach. Although it doesn't deny that disruption and loss accompany disaster, it also recognizes that we can't predict with any certainty what will happen, when it will happen, or how bad it might be. Instead, we have to look for ways to define the challenges in terms of strengths. Now, this starts with an appeal to vision and values, acknowledging the tension between internal and external forces acting on an organization or community requires leaders to engage diverse perspectives, to get outside themselves, and empower people to take action consistent with their shared vision and values as they experience them. Even under the best of circumstances, we have to anticipate that powerful emotions accompany situations of change, disruption, and loss. By confronting the influence of our fears and desires on our expectations, we can orient people away from negative expectations to more positive and productive outlets for their energy and effort. Focusing on aspirations then requires leaders to focus not just on ends, but also on the means for achieving them. Empathy and efficiency, of course, have their place, but only when tempered by the virtue of equity, which ensures everyone feels valued and heard. Even when decisions don't quite go their way, getting people through the rough patches requires a commitment to continued improvement. Striving for excellence demands attention to evidence of progress, evidence of change.
Now, Marc, you and I have had a chance to chat many times over the years about your experience in New Zealand, and I know you've related this in terms of the values of the Kiwis and how they respond. Can you just give a brief example of how this has played out, how you've seen that as an example in the level of not just the immediate response, but then how that's changed the level of preparation following the earthquake that took place back in 2011, if I have it correct?
Sure. The earthquake, well, actually 2 fairly large earthquakes followed by or accompanied by a sequence of about 10,000 aftershocks that were large enough to be felt, impacted the community. At the time of the first earthquake in September of 2010, the mayor of Christchurch, Bob Parker, was facing re-election. And many legal observers believed that he would be defeated by a more charismatic center-left candidate who was running after having retired from Parliament. One of the criticisms of Bob Parker was that he was essentially a charismatic leader, and that was used as an epithet more than an accolade, in the sense that there was a view that he might be an empty shirt. Bob was able to turn the tide on people's expectations by demonstrating, as I said earlier, courage, compassion, connectedness, and using his skills as a communicator to show people that he was in control of himself and therefore in control of the situation. Of course, that led to engaging people in the community at all levels of the response and recovery operation, especially when it came to engaging emergent volunteers.
So let's change our perspective. It's been 10 years since the 2008 financial crisis, and while we're 10 years away from that, still the reverberations are felt to this day in terms of how people perceive what happened. In many cases, their reorientation within their own organization, or to the system that they're within. And I'd like to get your opinion on how a leader turns their situational awareness in a crisis of this type to a more effective response.
Agility. An agile response requires sensitivity to the way in which our internal disposition as leaders influences and in turn is influenced by others. This begins with self-awareness and situational awareness. These are the key building blocks to agile crisis leadership. Good leaders attend to the details, but don't lose sight of the big picture. They anticipate changes, they appreciate diverse interpretations, they ask clarifying questions, they amplify weak signals to ensure they're not overlooking critical elements. As we learned looking back now at the 2008 financial crisis, the need for an immediate intervention was evident to some much more than others. But there wasn't widespread agreement on what actions should be taken. When people look to leaders in complex situations, they expect the leader to attenuate change by acknowledging conflicting perspectives, articulating shared values, arbitrating conflicts between competing virtues, and aligning effort and action toward aspirations and shared objectives. I think in retrospect, we can see that there were some missed opportunities in the response to the financial crisis because people did not agree that the leadership that was being exercised reflected this kind of action. In turn, leaders have to look at the ways that people respond to these interventions and actions by adopting new information as it becomes available, applying the lessons that they and others have learned, by adjusting their own expectations and amending their approach to reflect shared sensibilities. In the end, the truest test of leadership, in my view, is the ability of leaders to demonstrate accountability. Now, I need to make it clear that this isn't the same as accepting blame or assigning blame, because the emphasis here is on responsibility and atonement. Accountability demands that we make amends when we have erred, and doing so requires leaders not only to assess responsibility where responsibility is due, but also to answer for their own decisions and actions. Ultimately, they have to allocate responsibility for changes in behavior and action that reflect the advice of the decisions and actions they affect. In other words, they need to be forward focused rather than backwards focused. For me, the 2008 financial crisis really represents a missed opportunity. Although we have seen many changes, it seems to me that there's been very little consensus that suggests people are either satisfied with those responsible have been held accountable, or that the conditions that led to the crisis have been addressed in ways that ensure we're going to avoid repeating it. Indeed, to the contrary, we've seen little agreement as to what happened at one point or another, or what stopped the economy when it appeared to be in free fall. And we haven't addressed culpability in any meaningful way. Such, I think we've failed to appreciate and acknowledge what constitutes an appropriate and effective response to crisis.
So one final note, and bringing this back to, we've covered a lot of different examples, from corporate to government, bringing it back to natural hazards. This past year, we've had quite an active hurricane season, one of the seasons where we've had the most number of hurricanes and the most ferocious storms. We've had some of the most disastrous wildfires that have hit California. We've had a number of earthquakes and a major earthquake that hit Mexico City. What does leadership look like in making the necessary changes to prepare for these what seems to be an increasing number of catastrophic disaster events that we're facing?
Well, I've been surprised by the extent to which professional emergency managers define preparedness in terms of stuff. We have a tendency to place more emphasis on what we will need rather than what we will do with that. So much so that seems to assume that action really requires physical resources. As it turns out, and Daniel Aldrich at Northeastern University has uncovered some pretty profound evidence of this in his analysis of the 2011 Tohoku earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown in Japan, to indicate that social resilience matters much more than material preparedness. I saw this too in the way that New Zealand responded and recovered from the 2010-2011 earthquake sequence. Recognizing the interconnectedness of systems, emergency managers looked beyond their plans and the limited capabilities of first responders earlier than most expected. Acknowledging that the whole community owned the disaster and therefore owned the response and recovery meant that everyone had a part to play. Engaging rugby teams and university students and farmers and any other loosely affiliated group that might present itself allowed people to reorient themselves from the perspective of victim to the perspective of survivor. Former FEMA Administrator Craig Fugate spoke often of the importance of emphasizing the role of survivors. We can learn a lot from the way that people organize themselves before, during, and after a disaster or disruption. We know disasters amplify and exploit weaknesses, but they can also fortify and reinforce strengths. And this is illustrated pretty well by the way that a steel beam, for instance, exposed to fire reacts. As it heats up, it expands against restraint, and the beam actually gains strength. But if the fire continues to grow unabated, the beam will eventually fail. Controlling the fire requires us to focus on strengths. Keeping the beam intact requires us to manage the conditions of restraint or to limit the fire growth to keep the system intact. The illustration on this slide really brings this together by showing how moving from the one-centered perspective on security, having the resources necessary at hand, to a many-focused perspective that recognizes a commitment to systems and cooperation and safety, a broader perspective, begins to create a culture that values all and leverages strengths. Doing this results in a response that builds sustainability. I think a good example of this came to me from my experience working with the city of Portland, Oregon from 2008 to 2010. When I worked for the city's emergency management office, the emergency managers there, like many others, focused on the 3 days, 3 ways message. How do we get people to put away adequate resources to sustain themselves in the event of an emergency? We found, like most communities, when we surveyed the public, that between 10 and 25% of people in the community followed that advice. And it hardly ever budges above 20%. Yet we see plenty of examples, and Aldrich's work is a good example of some of this evidence, that even with such low levels of material preparedness, communities cope reasonably well with the effects of disasters through cooperation. So the question we began asking in Portland was, what is it that people are doing already that we can help encourage and enhance and support? And it turned out that some of the most compelling good works, if you will, of our citizens were a commitment to sustainable practices. 16% of the workday commutes into the central business district were by bicycle. Another 10% were by foot, people walking from home to work, and mass transit ridership was steadily increasing. We looked at things like the transportation choices people were making for evidence of how their actions to respond to changing circumstances, rising gasoline prices, the threat of climate change, to reduce their footprint on our society. And as a result, we started to think about ways in which we could support and sustain them in those efforts. Now, this led, not surprisingly, to citizens organizing themselves into not only the neighborhood emergency teams we'd already established, which was Portland's version of the CERT, Community Emergency Response Team concept, but building upon that concept to implement bicycle response. Now, today in Portland, you'll find an annual bicycle rodeo in which people compete in performing a variety of disaster response and recovery tasks, from moving supplies to navigating hazards. And I think this shows, along with efforts to promote community gardens and to organize other sustainability initiatives, just how engaged the community can be when you focus on social rather than material resilience. Of course, this leads back to one of the key findings that we're emphasizing as we think about resilience, and that is its relationship to sustainability. The more we can focus people on these positive actions they can take, the more likely it is that they'll reduce their impact on the systems, natural systems, human systems, that lead to damage and disruption.
So I think we're at the end of our webinar. Before we go and before we take questions, I would say, I put up a slide that has Marc's contact information, and where you can follow him on Twitter or communicate with him via Twitter. You also have my contact information if you would like to reach out to me. Again, my Twitter account is listed there. And also, I just wanted to note that we do have a podcast, Yeshiva University, on the topic of enterprise risk management and related areas. It's called Dancing with the Black Elephant. You can find it on iTunes. You can find it on Google Music, Stitcher, a number of different podcast outlets. You can also find it at SoundCloud. For information on our Masters of Science in Enterprise Risk Management, Yeshiva University, you've got our link there. And we also have a Twitter account that you can follow us on regarding that. So, Jerry, are there any questions that we have before we finish up for today? No questions. Well, Marc, I want to thank you very much for leading our discussion today. I know that it was very informative. We covered a lot of ground, a lot of different examples. And if you do have any questions on these topics, feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to entertain that. We do have a webinar coming up in the next month or so about the program. We'd be thrilled if you would plan on attending that. And we look forward to having you take part in our future events. So without anything further, I want to thank you very much for attending and wish you a good day.